By the second week in my cabin above the Sol Duc, I pulled a half-frozen young one from floodwater and kept it breathing through the night, beside my stove. At dawn, 3 full-grown figures stood beyond my fence line without a sound, watching the windows as if they were taking account of a debt. I had spent 41 years carrying other people's letters and bad news, then moved up the mountain to sit with my own, and that morning taught me grief could be carried another way. I came up the logging road in late September with 1 trailer, 1 dog, and too many boxes of paper I had no use for. The cedar cabin had belonged to a retired school mechanic who died in town 2 winters before. His daughter listed it cheap because the roof needed patching, and the footbridge over my creek had a split stringer at midspan. I did not negotiate much. I wanted distance, rain, and work I could do with my hands. The first morning there, I woke before light by habit, not purpose. For 4 decades, my day started in the dark, first at the sorting case, then at the wheel before most porch lights clicked on. Even retired, my body kept the old clock. I sat up, listened to rain on the metal roof, and reached to the left side of the mattress before I remembered that side had been cold for 11 months. Scout was already awake. He thumped his tail once and put his chin on my boot while I laced it. He had gone grey around the muzzle and one ear bent where a bull calf stepped on him years ago. He followed me to the stove, to the sink, to the door, and stood there while I checked the weather strip with my thumb. When I opened up, he looked into the dark yard first, then back at me, waiting for my nod. The valley air at that hour smelled like wet bark and riverstone. I carried a milk crate of split fir from the woodshed and stacked it by the stove in 2 tight columns, bark side down. I set water to boil in Lena's dented enamel pot, blue with a white rim chipped at the lip, and ground coffee with the hand mill until my palms warmed. I did each step the same way I had done it in 3 rentals, 1 tract house, and our last small place in Port Angeles. Routine was the only thing that still fit. By 6, I had eaten oats with a spoon standing upright in the bowl and stepped out with a maul. The rounds were green but manageable. I split what I could, set aside knotty pieces for kindling, and worked until sweat ran down my back under wool. Scout slept in the sawdust near the stump, opened one eye when I paused, then slept again. I liked the sound of steel on wood. It did not ask anything. The cabin sat on a bench above the creek, with alder at the lower edge and old Douglas fir climbing the slope behind. A hand-built fence marked the garden patch, mostly gone to grass. The lower gate leaned. The pump house had 1 warped board and a hinge that squealed. The place needed all of me, which was the point. If I had enough repairs lined up, I did not have to sit at the table and count what was missing. I had not been home when Lena's stroke hit. That fact had corners on it. It never rounded off. She called while I was halfway through Route 12B, near a cedar mill spur where reception came and went. I did not hear the first ring. When I called back, a nurse answered and asked if I was driving. I remember pulling onto gravel, putting the hazard lights on and looking at 3 boxes of holiday catalogues stacked in the jump seat. I remember saying, "I can be there in 40 minutes." I remember the nurse not answering that part. After she was gone, people told me I could not have changed the outcome. The doctor said it in a careful tone. My sister said it over soup I did not taste. Men at the station said it in the loading bay with their eyes on pallet wrap and scanner screens. Maybe they were right. A route teaches you that facts do not bend because you want them to. But that truth sat in my chest like a stone, all the same. I carried news for everybody else and missed my own door. In town, retirement felt like standing in an aisle after the lights went out. Too quiet, too open. No next task ticketed and waiting. I tried mornings at the diner once, then twice, and learned I did not want kind voices or small talk about weather fronts. I turned off my phone more days than not. I watched the barometer instead. Falling pressure meant rain by dark. Rising pressure meant frost in the low grass. Those things were useful. They did not ask for explanation. By the end of my first week in the cabin, I had patched the roof seam above the kitchen, reset 3 loose porch boards, and replaced the bridge stringer with pressure-treated lumber from town. I ran lag screws through both ends and tested it with my full weight before I trusted Scout to cross. He trotted over, stopped in the middle, sniffed the rushing water, and came back like he approved of my work. Inside, I kept one room mostly untouched, the corner by the front window where Lena used to read. I brought her chair up, even though it took too much space. Scout slept beside it each afternoon, curled tight, nose tucked under his tail. I never told him not to. On wet days, I found myself talking toward that corner while I sharpened tools or peeled potatoes, then stopping halfway through a sentence when the room reminded me who was not there to answer. I still sorted letters at the kitchen table, though none needed sorting. I had brought 2 banker boxes marked with old route numbers in black marker. Dead letters, change of address cards, holiday cards sent back with no forwarding order, notes people gave me with cookies in December. I laid them out in neat stacks by street, then by number, as if proper order might settle something inside me that had no slot. Scout watched from the doorway while I worked and sighed when I tied each bundle with twine. On Saturdays, I drove down for feed, propane, and whatever hardware I had forgotten to buy once and for all. I kept those trips short. The cashier at the farm store asked if I was settling in. I said, "Roof is holding." He nodded and rang up duct tape, lamp oil, and a sack of apples. I did not tell him why apples felt necessary. One evening near the end of that first week, the clouds lifted just enough to show the ridgeline above the valley. The fir tops held the last light, and the creek ran steel grey below the bridge. I stood at the fence with a mug in my hand and watched mist move between trunks in long, thin bands. Scout leaned against my leg, steady and warm. I realized then that silence in the mountains was not empty. It had weight and it had shape, and if a man stayed still long enough, he could hear where his own breath fit inside it. The second week began with colder mornings and a wind out of the west that carried rain before noon. I moved the apple crate onto the porch under cover and stacked another rank of wood near the door. I checked the stream gauge stake I had pounded by the crossing and marked water height with a carpenter pencil. At dusk, I latched the gate, set Scout's dish by the stove, and wrote down numbers in a pocket notebook, the way I used to log mileage and signatures. I did not call anyone. No one called me. That was how I wanted it while I learned the place, one chore at a time, one day set down after the next. Work in the morning, repairs in the afternoon, wood smoke at dark. The old grief did not leave, but it stopped rushing at me from every direction. It sat where I could see it, like a heavy parcel on a table, addressed in a hand I knew by heart. I sat with that feeling a while. Elbows on the table, the lamp turned low, so the moths would leave the screen alone. Scout shifted in his sleep by Lena's chair and made the soft throat noise he made when he dreamed of running. The stove ticked as it cooled. Rain moved over the roof in narrow bands, then eased, then came again. I put both hands around the mug until the last heat left it, then stood, checked the latch, and laid out tomorrow's tools in a straight row by the sink. Before dawn, I woke without the alarm, same as I had started doing in early October, and kept to the order that made the day sit straight. Kettle first, stove draft second, boots by the door, laces tucked so Scout did not chew them while I shaved. It was a shave day, so I used cold water and the cracked mirror propped against the flour tin, same way I had done en route for years, when motel glass was worse than none. Then oats, then dog feed, then wood. I marked each task in my head the way I used to mark parcel scans. If I skipped one, the day felt crooked. Rain held, so I stayed inside after breakfast and worked the jobs that suited wet light. I pulled nails from warped planks, sanded window trim, sorted hardware into coffee cans I had labelled with carpenter pencil. 10-penny, 16-penny, washers, lag bolts. A man could waste whole afternoons hunting one screw if he let things slide. When the cloud thinned near mid-morning, I crossed the footbridge and checked the creek bank where spring runoff had eaten at the trail. I shoveled gravel into low spots and tamped it with the flat side of the maul. Scout came with me as far as the survey marker stump, then stood and watched the trees uphill while I worked. He did that more than he used to. Ears up, body still. When I looked where he looked, I saw only wet fern and cedar trunks dark with rain. By dusk I had found comfort in small numbers again, and wrote them down before supper. Woodstack height, rainfall in the gauge tube. Barometer needle at dawn and dusk. I kept it all in the pocket notebook with dates and short notes. No extra words. 5:20 a.m. Heavy fog. 2:10 p.m. Bridgeboards dry. 7 p.m. Stove holding at 350. Some evenings I added one line about Lena, plain as weather. Her scarf still in hall drawer. Saw woman in town with same red gloves. Dreamed hospital corridor again. Then I closed the notebook and set it under the salt crock. Thursday came on with low cloud and steady drip off the eaves. So I baked bread because Lena had taught me how, and because flour stayed cheaper by the sack than by the bag. I warmed water to blood heat, stirred yeast in a chipped bowl, and watched it foam while Scout sat under the table, waiting for heel ends. I kneaded on a board that rocked on one corner, and dusted flour into every crack in my hands. The cabin smelled like wet wool and yeast and cedar smoke. When the loaf came out, I rested it on a rack by the window and listened to crust crack as it cooled. I spoke out loud sometimes, but only for practical things. Need to tighten that hinge. Rain by dark. Do not track mud on the rug. Scout got most of it. He cocked his head at commands and ignored commentary. That afternoon I dropped a box of old route cards and watched them scatter under the table, and I said Lena's name as if she were in the next room. The room gave me nothing back. I knelt down, gathered the cards, and sorted them by zip code until my knees hurt. The following morning I drove into town for feed and lamp oil before the school buses started stacking traffic on the 2-lane. People asked short questions. You settling in? Road still passable up there. How is the old healer? I answered short and paid cash. At the feed store, the cashier slid my receipt over and said, "Snowline dropped fast this year." I nodded and said, "I saw it on the ridge." That was enough. I loaded pellets, lamp oil, and apples into the truck, then drove out before noon. Saturday near noon, I dusted Lena's chair by the front window with an old t-shirt, same as I had promised myself I would. I kept it angled toward the creek bend where light held longest. I did not sit in it. Scout took his naps there with his back against one leg, and I let him. Near dusk, when the sky flattened to pewter and the valley went quiet, I read old mail labels the way some men read scripture. Names, roads, box numbers. People gone, houses sold, kids grown and moved. Paper held traces of lives that had moved on without asking permission. The first odd thing happened on a wet Tuesday near sunset. I had brought the apple crate onto the porch under the eave to keep it from soaking. There were 14 apples when I set it down. I counted because I had planned 2 pies. and wanted enough left for Scout, who liked slices with his evening feed. When I came out after dark to bring in split kindling, there were 12. No peels on the porch, no muddy paw marks, no scratch marks on the crate slats. I checked with my flashlight along the steps and under the bench, then shrugged and wrote it off to my own bad count. That night, I set 10 apples in a row before bed so there would be no arguing with myself in the morning. At first light, there were 8, each gap clean, as if a careful hand had lifted them one by one. The porch boards held only rain sheen and my boot prints from dawn. No raccoon tracks, no deer sign. Scout sniffed the crate, then lifted his nose toward the tree line and stood still until I tapped his collar. He followed me in, but he looked back once over his shoulder before the door shut. Rain stayed on through the day, low cloud pressing the woods close. Drops hit swordfern like knuckles on thin wood. The creek ran hard enough to talk all afternoon. The next morning, I carried a wrench and grease gun to the pump house because the handle had started to complain again. Grass by the corner post was flattened in a narrow strip. Not trampled, just laid over, as if something heavy had stood there and shifted weight. I crouched and touched it. Fresh bend, still springy. Scout did not come close. He stood at the bridge and watched uphill. That afternoon I walked the fence line and found an alder by the lower gate twisted at shoulder height. Not snapped by wind. Twisted. The bark had peeled in a bright spiral and the wet wood under it looked new. I put my palm against the break. It came to me at chest level. Too high for elk rubbing. Too clean for stormfall. I circled for tracks and found only churned leaves and one deep heel mark that rain had already softened at the edges. I told myself rot could make wood fail strange ways. I said it twice. By the second week of October, Scout was growling toward the same stand of vine maple each evening at nearly the same hour. He did not bark. That was what stuck with me. Scout barked at delivery trucks, at ravens, at my own reflection in the dark glass if I moved too quick. But this was different. He stood with his weight forward, a low vibration in his chest, then quieted when I stepped beside him. Once, he put his head against my knee and looked up, as if checking whether I saw what he saw. I saw mist climbing from the creek and trunks fading into shadow. Nothing moved. I moved an old game camera from the shed and mounted it on a cedar post facing the porch and lower yard. The battery compartment had corrosion. I cleaned the terminals with a pocket knife and set it to motion capture with date stamp on. Next morning, the apples were down by 1, and the camera card held 23 clips of rain, one clip of Scout at 2:14 a.m., and a blurred branch swaying at 3:02. I watched each file twice at the kitchen table, then once more after supper, slower. Nothing useful. I changed batteries anyway. After another night of rain, the sky finally cleared hard and cold. I took a rake to the mud by the pump house and smoothed a fresh patch the size of a door. I did not tell myself why. Habit, maybe. Same reason I squared wood piles and aligned tool handles. Order gave a man a fair look at what passed through. I checked that patch at noon and saw only squirrel tracks and one heel of my own boot from when I leaned in. I checked again before dark and stopped at the edge. A print sat in the center of the smoothed mud. 5 toes. Broad forefoot. Deep pressure under the ball and heel, with an arch line between that, looked too human until I measured it with my folding rule, and came up with just under 15 inches long. Too wide for any boot. No claw marks like bear. The toes were straight across, not splayed. The depth told me weight, and the clean edges told me it was recent, made after the last light rain, and before the wind dried the surface. I stood there long enough for my calves to stiffen. Scout came up behind me, gave one short huff, and sat down instead of growling. I looked for a second print and found it 2 feet ahead, set careful and parallel, as if whatever made it had paused, listening to the pump tick and the creak below. I did not cast it. I did not photograph it. I marked the spot with 2 stakes and a strip of survey tape, then backed away without stepping near the edges. Inside, I set water on for coffee, though it was near supper time. My hands moved clean, measured, no shake. I opened the notebook and wrote the date, weather, and what I saw in plain words that could not argue back. Then I added one line I had not expected to write in my own house. Tracks by the pump. Not bear, Scout knows. I closed the notebook and held the pencil in my hand until the coffee boiled over and hissed on the stove lid. Scout flinched at the sound, then looked at me from Lena's chair as if asking whether we were still keeping to regular order. I wiped the spill with a dish towel, poured what was left into my mug, and set the notebook under the salt crock. Outside, rain had thinned to a soft drip from the eaves, and the light through the window had gone flat and grey. I stood at the sink and watched the pump house through streaked glass. The survey tape I had tied to the stakes hung still. No wind at all. That made the creak louder. It pushed over stone with that heavy, even sound that could cover footsteps if a body moved slow enough. Scout came to my side and pressed his shoulder against my leg. He was warm, steady, and quiet. He did not look at me. He watched the lower yard. I put on my coat and took the flashlight, though it was not dark yet. Habit. I opened the door and waited one breath before stepping out, giving Scout room to choose. He went first, head low, ears forward, then stopped on the porch boards and tested the air. I followed him down the 2 steps into wet grass. The mud near the pump held both prints clean and deep, and nothing new crossed over them. I circled wide and checked the fence line, the bridge approach, the alder break by the lower gate. Fresh water beaded on everything. No new sign I could read. When I came back up to the porch, I set the flashlight down and split kindling from a knotty fir block I had left under cover. Steel on wood settled me. 2 strikes, rotate, 2 strikes more. Stack by size. Thumb-width pieces for quick flame, wrist thick for holding. I worked until my forearms burned and daylight softened at the tree line. Scout stayed near but did not lie down. Every minute or so he looked toward the vine maple stand above the survey marker. At dusk I carried the last armload to the porch. The valley took on that blue colour it got before full dark, when depth went strange, and every trunk looked farther away than it was. Mist came up from the creek in narrow bands and drifted through the lower alders. I set the wood crate down and straightened, and that was when movement caught at the edge of my sight. Not at the pump, not by the fence, higher where the old game trail cut across the slope behind vine maple and cedar. I turned my head slow and saw a shape between trunks, half screened by wet leaves. Tall, dark, upright. It stood still enough that I first took it for a burnt snag, but then I saw breath leave it in a pale burst and vanish. My hand stayed on the hatchet handle hanging from my belt. I did not lift it. I did not call out. My knees locked and my throat went dry like I had swallowed cold ash. Scout gave one low growl, then stopped mid-sound. He leaned forward with his weight over his front paws, not barking, not backing up. I watched his tail. It was level, not tucked, not high. That told me as much as the shape did. The figure remained where it was, maybe 40 yards upslope, maybe less in that light. Shoulders broad, arms long past where a man's would hang. Head set low between those shoulders. No hat brim, no shine from skin. Rain had darkened the fur, so it took light differently than bark, a dull matte against wet cedar. I could not make out the face. I could feel where it was looking. Fear came first in my body. The old animal kind. Tight chest, shallow breath, palms slick. Wonder came right behind it, just as hard. Not a story told over diner coffee, not a cast in plaster passed hand to hand. A living thing standing in my yard margin, watching me like I was the one out of place. I stayed there, one hand on the crate, one on the hatchet, and counted my breaths the way I had done in hospital waiting rooms. 4 in, hold, 4 out. The figure shifted once, small and controlled, weight changing from one foot to the other. No bluff charge, no raised arms, no teeth. Just that careful stillness. I heard myself speak without planning to. "It is all right," I said, voice low and rough from disuse. "I see you." The words hung there and went nowhere. Scout glanced up at me, then back to the slope. The figure tilted its head a fraction, almost like it was listening for tone more than meaning. Then it stepped backward. One step, another. It moved through vine maple without hurry, leaves springing back behind it, and in 3 seconds the shape broke apart into shadow and tree and dusk. I kept staring at the same spot until I could not tell if I was seeing trunks or memory. I did not chase. I did not shoulder the rifle by the door. I stood until rain started again, fine and slanting, and wet my collar through. Inside, I latched the door and set the hatchet on the table. Scout shook water over the floorboards and went to Lena's chair, then turned and chose the rug by the front door instead. He lay with his head up, eyes on the threshold. I fed the stove, poured more coffee I did not need, and wrote in the notebook while my hands still remembered the shape. 6:42 p.m. Visual on upper slope by vine maple. Upright. Very tall, no aggression. Withdrew on own. I read that line twice. Then I added, Scout growled once, then calm. Night settled full and wet. Around 10, a knock sounded somewhere upslope. Not on my door. Wood on wood, 2 short hits, then nothing. I set the mug down and listened until my ears rang. No second knock came. I stayed in my chair another hour, lamp low, rifle across my knees, but safety on. Scout slept light, waking at each pop from the stove. At midnight, I banked the fire, checked the latch again, and lay down with my boots pointed at the door. Sleep came thin. I woke before dawn with the sense of being watched, though the window gave back only my own dim reflection and black yard beyond it. By first light, rain had moved east and left clean cold behind. I stepped out to check mud by the pump. The 2 big prints were softened at the edges from overnight drizzle. No new tracks crossed them. At the survey marker stump near the bridge, something had disturbed the moss. A long, shallow press like a heel had turned there. I crouched, touched it, and stood again. Back at the porch crate, 8 apples had become 7. I carried that fact through breakfast, through dishwashing, through splitting kindling. By noon I had set and unset 3 plans in my mind. Ignore it and wait. Drive to town and tell nobody. Mount another camera and pretend that would settle anything. Around 1, while Scout slept with his paws twitching in a dream, I opened the fridge and took out 2 eggs. I boiled them hard, cooled them in creek water, and peeled them clean at the sink. Then I wrapped yesterday's trout bones in wax paper and tucked the bundle under my arm. Scout followed me to the door and stood in front of it. "Come on," I told him. He did not move until I touched his collar. Then he stepped aside and went with me across the yard. The clouds had lifted enough to show ridgelines through breaks in cedar. Air smelled of wet earth and cold fern. I walked to the old survey marker stump, worn flat on top from weather and old logging tape. I set the 2 eggs there and laid the trout bones beside them. No ceremony, no bait line, just food where it could be seen from the slope and from the creek bend. I straightened and spoke toward the trees, not loud. "For the young one, if there is one," I said. "For whoever took apples." Scout looked at me, then uphill. His ears stayed forward. No growl. I went back to work because there was always work. I reset a loose hinge on the pump house door and greased the handle pivot. I replaced one split picket at the lower gate. I cleaned ash from the stovepan and carried a bucket to the compost trench. All afternoon I felt the slope at my back like a held gaze, but each time I turned I saw only branches moving under light wind. At dusk I put on my coat and stepped onto the porch with no tool in my hand. Scout came and sat against my boot. We stayed there while light drained out of the yard and the creek turned from silver to black. The stump sat where I had left it, pale in the dim, and I could still make out 2 eggs on top. Then mist thickened low and hid the base. I blinked, and when the mist shifted clear, the stump was empty. I did not hear steps. I did not see a body move. One moment food sat there. The next moment, it did not. Scout gave a low breath through his nose and settled his chin on my foot. That night, no knocks came from upslope, no chuff by the rain barrel. The quiet did not feel empty. It felt occupied, like a room where someone had just stepped into the next doorway. At dawn, I walked to the stump before coffee. The eggs and bones were gone clean. In their place sat 3 river stones, wet and dark, stacked from large to small, in a neat column that would have fallen if set by careless hands. Beside them lay 1 crow feather, straightened and placed north to south along the grain of the wood. No claw scratches, no scat, no scattered shell. Just that arrangement, deliberate and still. I stood there long enough for the cold to creep through my socks. Scout circled once, sniffed the stump, and sat down facing the trees as if keeping watch over a mailbox on a road with no houses. I took a photo this time with the old digital camera from my route days. Then I carried the stones and feather to the mudroom shelf where I kept odd finds. A rusted square nail, an elk tine tip, Lena's broken clothespin bag clip. I did not hide them, but I did not put them in the open window either. I wrote the details in the notebook and underlined 1 line once. Gift returned. By the 3rd evening, I repeated the offering at the same hour. 2 boiled eggs, fish scraps if I had them, apple slices if I did not. I used the same stump and left before full dark. Scout came each time, and each time his body told me more than the trees did. First night tense, weight forward. Second night alert, but quiet. Third night, he sat before I did, tail against porch boards, eyes on the slope, breathing even. On that 3rd night, just as light thinned to the last band over the ridge, I saw movement again, where vine maple met cedar. The same broad shape stood partly behind a trunk, farther back than before, but clear enough that I could mark shoulder line and arm length. It stayed there while I stood on the porch. I kept my hands visible at my sides. Scout did not growl. "I left food," I said, not raising my voice. "No trouble here." The figure remained still for a long count, then lowered slightly, not a crouch, more like a nod given from distance. It turned sideways, and for one breath I saw a smaller form pass behind it, quick and low to the ground. Then both shapes moved uphill and were gone between trees. I stayed on the porch until full dark, listening to the creek and to my own breath settling back into me. When I finally stepped inside, I did not latch the door right away. I stood with my hand on the frame Lena once painted and felt the grain under my thumb. The house still held its emptiness. My grief still sat where it had sat. But something had entered the edge of my days that did not demand words and did not ask me to forget. By the end of that week, every night at nearly the same hour, I carried food to the survey stump. And every morning I found the stump cleared and one careful sign left in return. On the 7th evening of that exchange, I carried the bowl out at the same hour and found the stump already occupied, not by a figure, by sign. 2 alder switches had been bent and tucked under a stone, pointing downslope toward the creek crossing, not upslope toward the game trail. The feather from the day before was gone. In its place lay a strip of cedar bark peeled fresh and twisted tight, the way a man might twist wire to mark a gate he wanted noticed in the dark. I stood with the bowl in my hands and followed the line those switches made. The crossing sat lower than the stump, where the creek narrowed between root walls and ran fast after rain. Nothing moved down there but water and shadow, yet Scout had gone stiff beside me. He did not growl. He pressed his muzzle into my thigh once, then stepped forward and looked back to make sure I was coming. I set the bowl on the stump untouched. I did not like stepping off my own pattern at dusk. I liked it less with rain building over the ridge and the creek already talking louder than usual. But the way those switches pointed was deliberate enough that it set my teeth on edge. "Easy," I said to Scout, more for myself than for him. We went down by the footbridge first. The new stringer I had bolted in still held, but the planks were slick, and the handline I had tied along one side was wet and loose. I tightened the knot without thinking, then crossed and dropped to the narrow trail along the cutbank. Air near the water carried that raw cold that climbed through boot leather and into bone, and a warm wind rode over it from the west, carrying rain scent and cedar pitch. Halfway to the crossing, Scout stopped and lifted his head, his ears angled toward the bend below the root fan where spring runoff had undercut the trail. I listened and heard it then, low at first, almost buried under current, not a coyote yip, not a bear bawl, a chest-deep cry that broke in the middle like breath hitting pain and running out. The sound came again, shorter, close. I crouched and moved to the bank edge. A cottonwood had tipped years ago, leaving a wall of roots like a fan. Flood debris had jammed there, limbs, reed mats, a broken section of old fencing wire, and one cedar pole from somebody's upstream bank repair. Water pushed through that tangle in 2 hard channels. In the near channel, pinned against a root, was the young one I had glimpsed behind the adult days before. It was smaller than I had guessed from distance, maybe 4 feet at the shoulder if it stood straight, though now it was twisted on its side with one leg trapped under the cedar pole and debris. Wet, dark fur lay flat against narrow ribs. The trapped leg sat at a wrong angle below the knee, and each time it tried to pull free, the current shoved its chest down and rolled its head against bark. 10 yards away on the opposite bank stood the larger male. He was soaked through, arms hanging long and heavy, shoulders high and rigid. He did not bluff. He did not rush. He held his ground with his weight planted and eyes fixed on me. Rain had not started yet, but the first drops were coming through leaves, fat and warm, striking water like tossed pebbles. Upstream, I heard another log hit rock and turn. I had just enough time to understand the choice. Walk back to the cabin, take Scout, bolt the door, and tell myself nature handled its own. Or step down into that current with one bad knee and a 70-pound dog on the bank, and hope I could free the leg before floodwater climbed another 6 inches. There was no middle path that let me stay clean. The young one cried again, weaker. The male across from me hit the ground once with the flat of his palm. Not threat, urgency. I unclipped my belt knife and set it on a stump where I could grab it. I stripped off my coat and shoved it at Scout. "Stay up," I told him. "You hold here." He stood over the coat and trembled, eyes jumping between me and the trapped body. I slid down the mudbank and felt current catch my shins hard enough to twist me sideways. The creek was snow-melt cold under warm rain, and the shock of it took my breath for one count. I planted both boots, reached for the root fan, and worked toward the jam one step at a time. Water rose to my knees, then thighs, then near my belt as I edged deeper. The young one showed teeth when I came close, not in anger, in panic, jaw shivering and snapping air. "It is all right," I said, short and low. "I am getting you loose." It did not settle, but it stopped thrashing long enough for me to see the pin. The cedar pole had rolled into a notch between roots and trapped the lower leg under packed brush and wire. I pulled once barehanded and got nothing. The pole was wedged by pressure from upstream debris. If I yanked without support, I would break more than the leg already had. I backed out 2 steps, slipping once to one knee, and looked to the bank where I had left my coat. Scout whined and pawed at it, but held position. My old mail satchel was up at the bridge approach, where I had dropped it earlier that afternoon while clearing brush. Leather cracked, but the shoulder strap was thick nylon I had replaced in my last working year. Strong enough for a parcel bag full of catalogues. Maybe strong enough now. I climbed out, chest heaving, and ran for the satchel. My fingers fumbled the buckle twice before I got the strap free. I grabbed a fence post from the brush pile by the lower gate, a short one I had cut for repairs, and came back down fast enough to slide the last yard on wet clay. Rain opened then, hard, flattening fern fronds and turning the bank into grease. By the time I got back to the jam, water had climbed another inch against my thigh. I drove the fence post into the mud above the root fan with a flat rock. 3 hard hits, then looped the satchel strap around it and cinched the free end around my chest under one arm. Not pretty, not good enough to keep me from going downstream if my footing failed. I tested the line with my weight, then waded back in until the strap went tight. The young one saw me return and tried to pull free again. Pain hit and it folded, breath stuttering. I put my left forearm across its shoulder to hold it still and reached down with my right to the trapped leg. Fur masked everything. I had to feel structure by hand. Knee above, shin below. The lower segment moved where it should not. I swallowed, shifted grip, and reached for the wire first. The wire had wrapped once around the cedar pole and once around debris, not around the leg. That was mercy. I cut it with the knife in 2 jerks and tucked the sharp end away from the body. Then I braced both boots, hooked my fingers under the cedar pole, and levered up against current pressure. It rose 1/2 inch and slammed back. Not enough. Across the water, the male moved 1 step toward the edge, then stopped when I looked up. He stood there with rain streaming off his brow, breath heavy, waiting. I reset. This time I wedged my shoulder under the pole, used my back and legs, and lifted while pulling the trapped limb toward me with one hand. The strap bit into my ribs. The post creaked. The pole shifted, rolled, and for 1 second the pressure came off. I dragged the leg free and fell backward into the channel as the pole dropped and shot downstream. The current grabbed me at the hips and spun me. The strap snapped tight and slammed me against the post hard enough to wring my teeth. I found footing, coughed water, and got one arm around the young one before it could slide back into the channel. It was lighter than a grown calf, but awkward, all wet fur and long limbs, shaking so hard my own hands shook with it. "Up," I said through my teeth. "Up now." I half lifted, half pushed it towards shallower water. It tried to stand and collapsed on the trapped leg with a hoarse cry. I got behind it, one arm under chest, one hand gripping fur at shoulder, and worked it inch by inch to the bank. Scout came down 2 steps, barking once sharp, then stopped when I snapped his name. He held there, trembling and wide-eyed. By the time I got the young one onto mud above the flow, my legs were numb and my fingertips had gone dull. Rain hammered the creek flat. The male on the far bank lowered his head, then looked uphill toward my cabin, then back at me. He did not cross. He did not leave. I slid my arm under the young one's neck and felt breath. Fast, but steady enough. The injured leg dangled at a bad angle below the knee. If I moved it wrong, shock would take over quick in that cold. I needed shelter and heat. The mudroom was closest and easiest to clean if things went rough. I cut 2 straight cedar splits from a deadfall with 3 fast strokes, stripped my shirt, and used it as padding with the satchel strap and duct tape from the tool pouch I still had on my belt. Field splint, ugly and crude, but it kept the shin from flopping while I moved it. I got the young one upright by pressing my shoulder under its chest. It leaned hard and tried to bite once when pain flared, teeth snapping near my sleeve, then sagged against me instead. We took 1 dragging step, then another. Scout ranged tight around us, barking toward the trees, then falling back to my heel when I called him in. At the bridge I stopped and looked at the planks slick with runoff. Carrying full weight across would put us both in the creek if I slipped. I shifted, got my right arm under its near shoulder and my left around its waist, and used the hand line with my fingers to pull us over 1 board at a time. The young one's breath came in short bursts against my neck, hot and sour with fear. Inside the yard, mud sucked at my boots. I shouldered open the mudroom door and backed us in. The room smelled of wet boots, soap, and old cedar shelves. I kicked the door mostly shut with my heel and lowered the body onto the rubber mat by the stove wall. Scout came in low, hackles up, then checked himself and stood between the door and hearth, exactly where I needed him. No speeches, no thinking beyond sequence. Heat first, water second. Keep breathing even. I fed the stove with dry fur and opened the draft full until flame caught bright. I stripped soaked towels from the line and rubbed water from fur in firm passes, working from chest outward so it did not chill at the core. Steam rose off both of us as the room warmed. The young one trembled hard enough to rattle the metal feed scoop on the shelf, then less again. I filled a basin with warm water and a spoon of salt, cleaned gravel and bark from scrapes along its side, and checked the splint. The leg was swelling but held alignment. I tightened tape once, not too much, and tucked an old wool blanket around shoulders and hips, leaving the face clear. Its eyes stayed open through all of it, dark and fixed on my hands, then on my face, then on Scout. Scout watched for a long count, then lowered himself to the floor without taking his eyes off the body. His growl thinned to breath and went away. He rested his chin on his paws, still between door and stove, steady as a sentry. I warmed broth from yesterday's chicken bones and held the cup near the young one's mouth. It sniffed, hesitated, then drank in short pulls. Some ran down its chin into the blanket. Enough went into matter. Colour came back under wet skin around the muzzle. The shivering eased another notch. Rain battered the roof and windows until the sound became one long sheet. I sat back on my heels in wet socks and a torn undershirt, hands raw, forearms striped with mud and cedar bark. The young one breathed slow and shallow, but regular. The stove heat pushed a soft wave through the room and held there. For the first time since I stepped into the creek, I looked up. Through the narrow mudroom window, beyond the fence and rain, a tall shape stood under the cedar at the edge of yard light. Motionless, watching the door, not advancing, not retreating. I met that gaze for one heartbeat, then turned back to the blanket, added one more split to the fire and stayed beside the young one until the trembling finally stopped. I stayed on the floor with my back against the mudroom wall, one hand on the blanket edge, listening to the rain work over the roof. The young one's breathing had found a pattern. In through the nose, out through parted lips, slow enough that I could match it without trying. Scout had not moved from his post between door and stove. He watched the threshold, then the window, then me, and each pass of his eyes seemed to ask the same thing. Hold steady. The shape outside shifted once and came into the weak spill of light from the mudroom bulb. Broad chest, long arms dark with rain. Scar over the brow I had not seen clearly on the slope. He stood just beyond the porch edge where runoff poured from the eave in a hard line. Water ran off him in sheets and pooled at his feet. He did not pace. He did not strike the wall. He waited. I rose slowly, knees stiff from cold creek water, and held both hands where he could see them. Scout gave one low sound from deep in his chest. I touched his neck without looking away from the doorway. Easy, I said. Stay. He stayed. The latch felt loud in the room when I lifted it. I pulled the door open 1 foot, then 2, and warm air rolled out into rain. The male stepped forward to the threshold and stopped under the lintel. Up close he was taller than any door frame I had ever hung. He lowered his head so the beam would clear his brow, and firelight from the stove reached him just enough to show wet strands of hair, skin darkened by weather, and eyes set deep under that scarred ridge. I had seen scared eyes and angry eyes in people all my life. At accident scenes on my route, at hospital entrances, at front porches where one letter changed a whole house. These were neither. They were alert, direct, and level. Not wild, not angry, knowing. He looked past me to the young one on the floor, then back to me. I took 1 step to the side and left the doorway clear. He did not enter right away. He reached one hand to the frame instead, palm open, fingers spread over the cedar board I had repaired that morning before the storm. The hand stayed there for a count of 5, maybe 6, as if he was reading grain through skin. Then he ducked and came in 1 pace, no farther. Scout stood up but did not bark. His legs trembled once and steadied. The male crouched by the blanket. His movements were careful for a body that size, precise and almost quiet despite the wet weight of him. He touched the young one's shoulder with 2 fingers, then the splintered leg, light as a nurse checking bandage tension. The young one opened its eyes, fixed on him, and made a low sound that sat somewhere between a sigh and a hum. The male answered with a short chuff through his nose. Nothing in that room needed translation. I fetched the 2nd cup of broth from the stove and set it on the floor a yard from his hand. He turned his head toward it, then toward me, and held that look again. I nodded once. He took the cup, brought it to the young one first, and tipped it slowly while I steadied the chin with my fingers. Most of it went down clean. When the cup was empty, he set it upright. Not dropped, not tossed, upright on the mat. Just after midnight, the storm broke harder for 10 minutes, then eased to a softer rain. In that quieter spell, I could hear the creek dropping from flood pitch toward its normal run. The male shifted his weight and sat back on his heels, still close to the young one. I sat across from him, both of us angled toward the stove, Scout between us with his head up. We stayed like that for a long while, silent except for fire and water and breath. I felt the old pull to fill silence with words, the way people do when they are afraid to leave truth uncovered. I let it pass. After a time, the male raised his hand and opened it toward me, palm up. It was not a reach. It was an offer held in place. I did not move fast. I put my own hand out and set my fingertips against the heel of his palm once. Light contact, skin to skin, then withdrew. His hand closed and rested on his knee. The room settled another notch. He stood first. He touched the young one's shoulder again and looked to the door. I shook my head and pointed to the splint. "Not yet," I said. "Morning." He watched my face, then the leg, then the stove, then the door. He lowered himself back down without protest. I fed 2 more fur splits into the stove and sat until my eyes burned and my wet clothes chilled against my skin. Each time I drifted, Scout's ears flicking brought me back. By first light, the rain had stopped. A thin grey wash lay over the yard and turned the cedar trunks silver. Mist moved low above the creek, not thick, just enough to blur fence posts at the far edge. The young one woke clear-eyed and drank water from a pan while I loosened and retaped the splint. Swelling held, but had not worsened. Good enough to move if we took it slow. I opened the mudroom door and stepped out first. Air smelled of cold mud, wet fir bark, and wood smoke that had gone sweet overnight. The male came behind me with the young one braced against his side. They paused at the porch as if testing balance, then started across the yard toward the lower gate, one short step at a time. Scout stayed at my knee, alert and quiet. At the fence line they stopped and turned. 3 other figures stood beyond the posts in the alder shade, full-grown, wide-shouldered, still as standing stone. They had been there long enough that I had not heard them arrive over the creek. None came closer. None showed teeth or raised arms. They watched the pair by the gate, then looked to me in turn. The male who had come inside touched the top rail once with his palm. Then he lifted his chin toward me, small and deliberate. I answered with the same motion before I knew I was doing it. He shifted the young one's weight and moved through the opening where the wire sagged. The others stepped back to make space, and the group took the tree line together. No hurry, no sound beyond brush, bending and springing back. I stood until the last dark shoulder passed behind cedar and was gone. When I finally looked down, something lay just inside the fence where they had paused. Crossed sticks, set clean and centered, a piece of river quartz bright against wet soil. And beside it, half muddied but unmistakable, Lena's brass thimble with the tiny dent near the rim from when she dropped it on concrete 20 years ago. I had lost it near the lower garden sometime before we sold our place in town. I had checked boxes for it twice and figured it was gone for good. I crouched and picked it up between thumb and forefinger. Cold metal warmed quick in my hand. For a second, I could see her at the kitchen table hemming work shirts, glasses low on her nose, pushing that thimble with her right thumb in small, practiced motions. The image came clean and did not cut. It just sat with me, steady as breath. Scout sniffed the crossed sticks, then looked toward the trees and sat down in the wet grass. No growl, no shake, calm. I carried the sticks, quartz, and thimble to the porch and set them on the railing while I checked the yard once more. No prints clear enough to cast in the churned mud. No broken boards, no torn wire. The cup I had set out for broth sat on its side near the steps, rinsed by rain, empty. I did not go to town that day. I did not call anyone. I stripped wet blankets, scrubbed the mudroom floor, boiled bandages, and hung towels where morning sun could reach them through the window. Work first, same as always. But each task felt set in a larger frame, as if the cabin had one more room than it had yesterday, and I had only just found the door. At dusk, I filled a thermos cap with coffee and carried it to the survey marker stump. Scout came with me and lay down before I did. Forepaws crossed, eyes on the bend where mist gathered. The creek ran lower and clearer, green over stone. Wind moved the tops of firs and left the understory still. I set the cap down and stepped back. No figure came while light held. No branch snapped. No knock sounded upslope. Still, the quiet did not press on me the way it had in those first weeks. It held shape. It held memory. When the last band of light thinned over the ridge, I picked up the empty cap and turned for the house. At the yard edge, I looked back once. Across the creek, between 2 old cedars, a broad outline stood half in shadow, watching the cabin. It stayed long enough for Scout to lift his head and settle it back on his paws. Then it turned and moved uphill into timber, leaving nothing behind but the faint sway of fern and a line of water dripping from a low branch. I touched Lena's thimble in my pocket before I went inside, and for the first time since the hospital call, the weight in my chest shifted from burden to company. I stood in the mudroom a long while after I shut the door, hand still in my pocket around Lena's thimble. The stove had burned down to red wood and soft heat. Scout circled twice on the rug by her chair and lay flat with a long breath, like he had finished a hard shift. I took the things from the porch railing one at a time and set them on the kitchen table under the lamp: crossed sticks, quartz, thimble. The river stones and crow feather were already on the mudroom shelf. I brought those in too. I did not pile any of it. I gave each piece its own place on the old oilcloth, like evidence laid out after a route accident, when the deputy asked me what I had seen first and where I had stood. Then I opened my notebook and turned back through every page since I came up the mountain. Weather marks, water height, apples missing, first print by the pump, figure at vine maple, eggs left, stones returned, the alder twisted by the gate, the night knocks upslope, the low chuff by the rain barrel, the smaller shape behind the larger one, switches pointing to the crossing, cry in floodwater, splint at the stove, hand on the doorframe. I wrote one clean line under the last entry. All signs accounted for, no damage taken. Exchange ended in peace. Scout lifted his head when I said it out loud. That is the record, I told him. He thumped his tail once and went back to sleep. After coffee, I took the old digital camera from the drawer and plugged it into the wall by the sink. The battery still held a weak charge. I scrolled through the files with my thumb. Rain, porch, stump, then the image of 3 stones and the crow feather laid straight on weathered wood. I checked the date stamp and wrote it in the notebook margin. I did the same with the photo of the print by the pump I had taken late, after edges had softened. Not perfect, enough to prove I had not imagined shape and scale. I printed nothing. I copied both files to a thumb drive and labeled it with masking tape. Sol Duke, October, keep private. Then I pulled the game camera card and watched every clip again on the old laptop I only used for maps. 23 rain clips from that one wet night. Scout at 2:14, branch blur at 3:02, and later one frame where a dark shoulder line passed the far edge of view and was gone. Too little for any office, too much for a man trying to lie to himself. I saved that frame, wrote the time in the notebook, and put the card in a small tin with spare screws. I noted it as stored, not submitted. I never called wildlife enforcement. I never sent an email to a reporter. I held the phone in my hand once, looked at the blank screen, and set it face down by the flour sack. Men spend a lifetime learning which mail is meant to be delivered and which is meant to stay sealed. This belonged to the second kind. By the first week of November, the rain settled into a long, patient pattern, and the creek dropped back inside its banks. I walked to the crossing in clear daylight with Scout and a shovel, cut away loose debris from the root fan, and pulled the last length of rusted fence wire from the bank so it would not trap anything again. I reset the trail with gravel and tamped it flat. The alder by the lower gate still showed its peeled spiral. Bright wood turned dull now by weather, and every time I passed it, I put my palm there and remembered how force could be careful and still be strong. At the pump house, the prints had gone with rain weeks ago, but the 2 survey stakes still stood where I had marked edges. I pulled the tape, rolled it, and tucked it into the notebook pocket. I left the stakes in place to hold the memory to the ground where it happened. At dusk, the knocks stopped completely. No sound from upslope, no chuff at the barrel, no missing apples from the porch crate. The disturbances had not faded by chance. They had closed like a gate after somebody passed through. One Saturday, I drove down for feed and lamp oil under a sky the colour of tin. The cashier at the farm store glanced at my forearm when I set the can on the counter. The scrape from creek bark had scabbed into a clean line. "Looks like you got into brush," he said. "Cleared a crossing in storm water," I said. He nodded, rang me up, and that was all. He had given me a look like he might ask more, then he did not. He never did. Not that day, not later. That thread stayed where it started, in polite silence between men who both respected boundaries. When I got home, I made a proper place for the items, so none of it drifted into junk. The stones and quartz went in Lena's old glass canister with the cracked lid. The crow feather lay flat in the atlas we used on road trips years ago. Page marker on the Olympic Peninsula. The crossed sticks I tied with plain twine and set above the doorframe beam where dry air would keep them from warping. The thimble went into her sewing tin for one night, then came back to my pocket by morning. After that, I kept it on the windowsill over the sink where first light hit brass, and warmed it. In mid-November, I walked to the survey marker stump at dusk with a thermos and a cap cup, same as I had done since they left the fence. I poured coffee and set it down. Scout lay at my boots and watched the creek bend. Mist moved low between cedars. At the far side, the broad figure appeared at the same hour as if timed to a route clock. He stood where timber thinned, never crossing, never calling, only facing the cabin for a long, quiet count before turning uphill. I did not wave after the first few evenings. He did not step closer after the first month. The ritual held because it held. Same bend, same light, same departure. It asked nothing else. By the second week of December, frost stayed on the grass until noon, and wood smoke sat low in the yard. I mended gloves by stove light and sorted one last box of old dead letters by route number, then tied the bundles and carried them to the shed loft. I did not need to sort them anymore. Muscle memory had done its service. I kept the notebook in the kitchen drawer, not hidden, and added only what mattered. Weather, creek, visit confirmed, scout calm. On Christmas morning, I set a small plate on Lena's chair with one orange and 2 ginger snaps, the way she used to do for neighbours who came by. Nobody came by. Scout ate one snap when I offered it. I ate the other and looked out at the cedar line while snow began to fall in thin, dry grains. At dusk, I poured coffee in the cap as usual. Across the creek, through falling white, the dark shape stood and stayed until the last colour left the sky. When he turned away, he touched one hand to a cedar trunk in passing, the same open palm he had put on my doorframe. Then he was gone into trees. By early January, I had fixed the lower gate square, replaced 2 porch planks and sharpened every tool in the shed. I had not grown less alone. I still rose before daylight. I still split fir rounds, boiled coffee in Lena's chipped pot, and moved through rooms that held one voice instead of 2. But the emptiness had changed texture. It no longer echoed. It listened back. One evening near the end of that month, the rain stopped just before dusk and left the whole valley rinsed and bright. The creek carried thin bands of gold where light slipped under cloud. I walked to the stump in dry gloves, set the thermos cap down, and stood with my hands at my sides. Scout settled against my boot, old bones careful on the cold ground, breathing slow. Across the water, among the cedars, the broad figure was already there. We stayed that way as light thinned, neither moving to close distance, neither turning away first. When the last edge of day gave out, he inclined his head once and stepped back into timber. I picked up the empty cap, touched Lena's thimble in my pocket, and listened to Scout's nails click soft on the bridge boards as we walked home to the cabin, the creek, and the quiet that was no longer empty.